Uh, you told me, by the way, that you were moving to the lake.
Oh, you
Uh,
remember that?
how was that? How is it?
I've been here. We've been here 3.5 years now.
Yes.
We moved in right before the fall before COVID hit, so it worked out, as good as it could have for that situation.
Now,
And my wife and I both built offices in our house, so that worked out.
that was my next question was, how much time are you spending working at home? Looks like you're at home now. It's different than when we talked before.
Yeah, I am on usually on Mondays and Fridays. I'm here. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is kind of our at Gallup. That's our similar to our advice in the book. that's
Yes.
that's what we've designated as our in office time. We still have flex time. We have had flex time at Gallup since the late '60s, 1969, I think to be exact.
Mhm.
Um, but those are the days when you can expect to see other people around. And we've actually got a bunch of interns coming in next week, so that'll be kind of fun. Um, about 30 some.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. You're a bit of an introvert, so that flexibility must feel good to you.
Well, it helps a lot with the focus time to get absorbed in something. Even before the pandemic, I blocked out at least one day a week to work from home. So
Yes.
it was not foreign to me.
Yep. Yes. I've been curious. I was thinking about our conversation and how in the world did you ever get hooked up with Gallup?
Hmm. Good question. Let's say I got lucky. I If you go all the way back, I had signed up. I was at the University of Nebraska. I signed up for a couple internships. One of them was with a company called Selection Research, which ended up purchasing Gallup and took on the name of Gallup. It was really more of like a merger of two companies together. But so I did an internship there, and Don Clifton asked me if I wanted to work with him in research, and I figured I better take up that opportunity and give it a shot. So I did that, and I finished all my graduate work while I was doing that, and so it just kind of built from there. It's been 37 years, over 37 years now.
Wow. Yes.
So the days accumulate.
I've talked with Tom Rath a few times, and
Mm-hmm.
because he's a grandson,
Yeah.
and Don seems to have been very influential in lots of people's lives.
Oh yeah. Yeah. He was quite a developer. He would give you, something to own, give you a project or an assignment that he just let you own and develop out. And it's always something that he was interested in too, obviously, but he was really good at ownership. He really understood that about people,
Mm,
need for autonomy and the need for ownership.
yes. So University of Nebraska. Are you a excuse me? Are you a Nebraska boy all along, or?
I was born in Iowa, Western Iowa, but I've lived in Nebraska most of my life.
Yes.
I was different parts of Nebraska, so I lived central, and then grew up junior high school in Western Nebraska, out by Colorado. So I've got a Colorado connection too, because we're just right next to the border, and Denver was the closest big city. But then I traveled east to go to college at Nebraska, the business school, which, by the way, Don and his family donated a ton of money to the business school at University of Nebraska. And that's um, it's a strengths kind of centered university now, or a business college.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful place. I go back there and meet some of the students once in a while, and then my graduate work was in psychological measurement. So undergraduate was in business. Where are
Yes.
you from originally, Dan?
I'm a Maine boy originally, brought up on
Okay.
a dairy farm there in the
Yeah.
middle of Maine. So
Yeah, I
it's
saw you're a farmer. I think I read that somewhere.
yes.
That
Well,
yeah,
I
the
call myself that, but I left home to go to college and never looked back, never had a desire to milk cows.
it's
Yeah,
hard
yeah,
work, huh?
yeah. Well, the Nebraska boys and the Iowa boys, they do more beef and,
Hmm.
crop farming.
Yeah.
That makes a little more sense to me. Milking cows twice a day, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Well, in Nebraska, you get into, eastern central Nebraska, and it is a lot of crops, corn and cattle. But you go out west, it's all ranch country out there, sand hills and ranch. There's not much good soil for growing. They grow some beets or something like that, but it's
Right.
you don't get any much corn out there.
No.
It's a different terrain out in the west.
I've been to Nebraska, and it's cornfield after cornfield
Yeah,
after cornfield.
driving down I-80, you just see a
Yeah.
lot of, until you get to um, the western part, and then it's all rolling sand hills and cactus and stuff.
Yes. So, why do you want to live on a lake in Nebraska? Because summer is like what, 3 days there, or what's the story on that?
Now we get a good 3 or 4 solid months of um, the falls are really nice out here. I got an outboard motor this year, and so I can have it in longer. So they put it in April or early May, and they can pull it out in October.
Yeah.
And you can still, so we've got good fishing out here. And I haven't been out fishing yet this year, but they're catching a lot of crappie out. We've got kind of these interconnected lakes where we're actually on an island, technically.
Great. Yeah,
It's
great.
they've got sand along the Platte River, and so they dredge out the sand, and you get these like 50, 60 foot deep lakes. It's clear, not the mud water, it's clear water, and good fishing and boating. So we had enough time in, and it's the winters are the tough part out here. You get 2 or 3 months of wind and cold, which isn't too fun. So I'm going to do a little bit more traveling in the winter, I think. Do some snowbird stuff.
Well, we thought about that a little bit too, and we go back and forth on spending time in warm weather. I mean, Pennsylvania it's cold, but it's milder than New England is. And so summer is longer, and yeah, it gets tiresome. We've thought about it a little bit. And
Well, Rolinda, my wife, and I want to. One of our goals in the next couple of years is to take a trip all the way down the East Coast. So start up in Maine and take a couple of weeks or whatever, and stop at some places. And my mom lives on the East Coast, so
yes,
in Virginia. But that northern, I guess I need to talk to you about what the best time of year is to do that. It's probably
well, for you, we went up last year after Labor Day and spent a couple of weeks on the ocean there. We love the seafood is the best in the world. Once you eat, if you like seafood, once you eat Maine lobster and scallops and clams and things, you'll be unhappy in Nebraska eating seafood. I can tell you that right now.
It's probably true.
But
maybe I shouldn't then.
Yeah. So when we go, and we're planning on going again this year after Labor Day, it's a great time of year. Usually it's cooler, still in the 70s, but you don't have you don't have bugs, and the tourist season is over. Route 1, which is what people do travel, and we went all the way to what it was the name of it. Anyway, we were about 40 miles from the Canadian border, so we went all the way up. And you travel Route 1 a bit, and it can be nasty in the summertime, but once you get past Labor Day, you can enjoy it. Anyway, that's my recommendation.
You'd recommend after Labor Day, like
I would.
That month after Labor Day, somewhere in there.
Yes, we actually left Pennsylvania the day after Labor Day, whatever it was last year. So we just let kind of like the Labor Day thing settle down. And because we were going to be there for a couple of weeks, we drove up. And you can't really fly that far north anyway. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So we drove up, and yeah, it was fantastic. Loved it. So much so that we're going to go back again. We ate lobster almost every day. So, you know what I mean? It's like you're there, and it's just fantastic. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I did when we went to Turks and Caicos. They had, as well, they had just fresh lobsters. I think I had it every day there.
Yes, yes. Different kind, obviously, you know that, but I don't, do they have claws in that area?
I can't remember. I
Yeah.
just ate it. I
Yes.
don't remember.
Right. Hey, I wanted to ask you a couple of things about the
Yeah.
book, and thanks for sending it.
Hmm.
I love some of the, the way you're framing some things up here, and still, I think, sticking with some of your core message. But I noticed the chapters are short. They were in your previous book as well. Is that an intentional thing for you?
We make our so one thing I'd ask you is if you were able to read it in 2 to 3 hours. If you were, then then we did our job. If you didn't, then we probably didn't do our job. So we're trying to condense our make our content as quickly absorbed as possible and kind of getting right to the point. So we intentionally, and It's a Manager, we wrote very short chapters. That was more of an experiment. It worked, so we carried it through on this book, and we some of them are longer than others, but we try not to make them any longer than what they need to be, and we do heavy editing. We do what we call read aloud, so we draft the content, then we actually read it word by word out loud, and if we get to a point where we start slowing down, we just cut it.
Yeah.
And so we think it's really important to have to just have the chapters not be longer than they need to be, really, to make the point. And one of the fun challenges in my work is the complexity of the research, but then also the challenge of making it useful to non-researchers,
Yes.
so that we actually maintain the truth of the research and at the same time make it useful.
Well, I think what I notice is you do have to pay close attention to the language. I think it's in some cases, you're trying to be very precise. So if you're a skimmer or a quick reader, you may miss some of the nuances. However, when it's a short chapter, page and a half, you have a feeling of momentum as you're, physically turning the pages. And, my brand is brevity. I've been writing 300
Mm-hmm.
words or fewer than that every day. So, I have a short attention span. So this totally works for me. I
Oh,
think
good.
the one thing, and I have a book coming out in September, and I'm working on the second one. And I think the thing that I miss and would enjoy even here is at least at the end of every two or three chapters, action items.
Oh, yeah.
I think what I'm going to do in the next thing that I do is, I don't think if you write short chapters, I'm not sure you can always do it. But if two or three of the chapters might in a traditional book be one, then at the end of three chapters, you give some action items.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I asked Brian Tracy who's written, I don't know how many books, not research books necessarily, but very successful
Mm-hmm.
books. I asked him about why he was a successful writer, and he said, I tell people what to do. And
Yeah.
I think there's something to that.
Yeah, we attempted to do that in the last chapter of this book, where
Yes.
we tried to get to the point and we weren't very bashful about it. I guess maybe because I'm getting older, I feel like we need to just get to the point, and I'm not as concerned about whether we're trying to sell something or not. I just want people to know, if we have good evidence that something works, they need to know it,
Yes.
and they can choose whether they use what Gallup provides or not. But that I'm trying to get more to the point in my writing that way, so that it's honest to the research, obviously, but that I also don't keep things away from people that they need to know that they can use right away. This book, Atomic Habit, did exactly what you're talking about. The chapters were longer, but I read it in just an afternoon. But it
Yes.
also has those summary points in it, which I think he did a good job of that. That's probably why it's such a good seller.
Thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, it is huge. That's a huge one. And you referred to at the end of the book, which was there's a couple there, but the CEO section. And I was surprised to see a very specific recommendation of Monday to Thursday. Just go ahead and just establish Monday to Thursday for workers who could be hybrid workers.
Right.
Go ahead and establish that as in-office days. I think we're getting, what I see is still a little foot dragging, or, like I just want to pick the days.
Yeah. And people really need some direction on that. And companies are can vary around that. We made that strong recommendation just to give some people something to start with. It's what we use at Gallup. It's what a number of companies are using it. Those are the days that most people say, these are the ones I want to be in the office.
Yep.
If you're going to pick 2 or 3. And some companies will adjust to that. For some companies, maybe it'll work Monday to Wednesday or whatever. But the key is that we bring some clarity and some predictability into how we're doing the in-office stuff. Otherwise, it gets really frustrating for people to make that dreaded commute in, which is less dreaded if you're engaged in your work because you're pursuing something you want to do. But it's become less tolerable for people, the commute, after everything we've gone through. 30 minutes now is intolerable versus if it was 45. So there's that kind of interesting little nuance. But if people are going to make that commitment, they need to know other people are going to be there. And it's frustrating for people when that doesn't happen. So just saying decide on your own doesn't really work. And then also mandating everybody needs to be in on particular every day, or making it feel like a mandate doesn't work either, because people learned a lot of independence and autonomy through this and learned they can work different ways. And there's some real honest learning that we can take away from that. And it's hard to take something away from someone once they've experienced it, of course, the endowment effect. We all know that. So I think leadership is more nuanced. Needs to be more nuanced than it's ever been before. So we have to, there has to be some clarity in those nuances. And we try to provide some of that clarity for people so that they can, put some guidelines in place so that people have some predictability. We call it smart autonomy.
Yes.
In our writing. But what that really means is let's put some structure in place so people know what to expect of their colleagues. The promise to be together is more to your colleagues than it is to leadership.
Yes. I noticed that shift in focus as well in the book. It was in the book. I'm one of the guys that I work with is a Home Depot leader, and they set some days, and they're trying to figure out blended or hybrid or whatever. And he said, I realized that there were some days I was in the office, but basically I was doing conference calls from the office. He said that doesn't make any sense to me. That so he's his team. He's making sure to work the kinds of meetings that really work best with face to face. We have to do that. And so if you have a set time, then it's a little easier to schedule that. So if it's going to be Tuesday to Thursday,
it takes some intentionality for sure.
Yeah.
People have to plan, and but it pays off. You can solve problems quickly if you're together. Maybe even problems you wouldn't have even thought of solving if you weren't together. Yeah. The more innovation. We all know that what happens in person is very different than the scheduled video. Video can work well. And first thing I said, Dan, when we were stuck in our homes, was thank God for technology. It really was a game changer in terms of just work moving along pretty seamlessly. In my type of work moving along pretty seamlessly. I know there's a lot of industries where it didn't.
Right.
But for a lot of people in remote ready jobs, and there were more remote ready jobs than we thought, because people were forced to kind of try out this experiment.
Yes. Yeah. And I think we're also, I remember when we started video conferencing, and you're so focused on yourself, and it's just very awkward. But these days you hardly even notice. You just, and that makes it work well. I noticed in the book, you like to use 1 to 5, not 1 to 7, not 1 to 10, not 1 to 100. you like to use 1 to 5. Now, I guess I should say, first of all, there are some areas that only fives matter, which I loved how
Mhm.
that was said. Only fives matter. What are the areas where only fives matter? And then I will ask about why 1 to 5 versus others.
Well, um, there are, in fact, most of the items we ask, fives matter a lot more than a four. So you'll see a lot of engagement scales where they combine fours and fives together. What that ends up doing is it waters down the predictability and the clarity of what you're trying to get to from a behavioral standpoint. We put a chart in our book that shows the business outcomes associated with people are responding a five versus a four versus a 3, 2, or 1, and there's clearly big difference between a 5 and a 4. To give you an example, we ask you our most foundational, basic employee engagement item that we have. I know what is expected of me at work. Think about the psychology behind giving a 5 to that. I'm clear. I know what my role is. When I go into work, I know what I'm going to be working on, and I know how that relates to my coworkers' expectation. You give a 4, you're backing off of that. You're a little bit uncertain, and uncertainty is not good. And it's another reason why we need to have ongoing conversations in the workplace, because we have to clarify priorities more continuously now because things change so quickly. And that's a really important. So that's another item that we found. I've received meaningful feedback in the last week. You give a 5 to that. It's one of these magical kind of items where 80% of people are engaged, and the average across the globe is about 20%. In the U.S., a little over 30%. So think about that kind of a lift from one behavior, and a 5 means a lot more than a 4 or 3. So from a scaling standpoint and measurement standpoint, our goal is to capture the most predictable information in the most efficient way possible. And a 5-point scale gets us there. And we really encourage the organizations we work with to try to grow that strongly agree percentage, because it means so much more from a behavioral standpoint. Think about almost any question you ask. Another one that we're encouraging people to add now is, at work I'm treated with respect. If you give anything below a 5 to that, there's something not right in that culture, something that you're hesitant about in terms of how people are treating you, and disrespect is toxic. We've seen so many examples of that over recent years, but it can be so toxic to an environment and a culture, and everybody should have the right to strongly agree to that. And in many cases, so if managers are having these regular, ongoing, meaningful feedback sessions with people, they're going to get ahead of those issues. They're going to learn about them, and they can get ahead of them before they escalate, or before someone goes down a path where they might feel disrespected, and maybe the other person didn't intend to disrespect them at all. Maybe it was very unintentional, and nobody cleared the air and figured that out. So I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but that's why we emphasize the percent 5s in the strong agreement, because it brings clarity to an environment, and we need a lot of clarity in our workplaces right now.
Yes, yes. So the scale of 1 to 5 versus 1 to 7, 1 to 10, 1 to 100, it's more about ease of understanding, ease of use, or is there intentionality with the 1 to 5 beyond that, I should say?
It's both maximizing the scale's ability to predict performance outcomes, which we know is important to organizations, whether it's customer, or whether it's retention rates, or whether it's profitability, productivity, absenteeism rates. It maximizes predictability in the most simple method possible. We've looked at 7-point, 10, a lot of different types of scales. You don't get much lift, and it's more difficult to interpret the information you get back. You've got to combine points together and things like that, instead of going right to the answer and knowing with much more clarity what the answer means that the respondent is giving or the team is giving. You still have to have a discussion, though, about how people, if you measure knowing what's expected, you still have to have a discussion about what's unclear, in the context of the work. So you still have to get into the context of the work to understand it. But interpreting the scale is much easier, and we still maximize the predictive value.
Yes. Well, you bring up something I had, as I thought about our conversation, I was going to ask about the yes or no question that is so often in surveys, um, and it's a dead end. A yes or no question is a dead end unless you do the follow-up work, which I know is your intent. I wasn't even going to ask it because I knew that was what the story was, but yeah. So we're looking for the fives on a scale of 1 to 5. And if it's not a 5, what does it take to get to a 5?
That's right. And to have a discussion about what's missing,
Yeah.
And something as concrete as materials and equipment, people, and putting in the context of the work that somebody's doing and how that would, maybe help a customer, or maybe it would help them do their work more efficiently, and then you got to do the ROI on that. So, but you've got to have the discussion. Something, again, as concrete as that, materials and equipment can actually cause people a ton of stress.
Yeah.
It's linked to stress because people feel they're trying to get something done and there's a barrier to them getting it done. And some of those kinds of issues are why we see globally, we've seen stress increase for the last decade plus among workers. And it's now kind of peaked at 44% of people say that they experienced a lot of stress the previous workday. And so that's something, stress and burnout is certainly something now that we're seeing organizations are concerned about. And mental health, of course, is something that's come to the surface now, and that we're seeing increases in mental health issues. And I don't think you can separate that from, how we're working, where we're working, and the experience we've gone through these past few years.
Well, the book has a platform for customers. It starts out with a focus on customers. Drucker said the purpose of a business is to create a customer. And I was delighted, by the way, to see some references to Drucker. And he was a strength-based guy before strength-based was, popular. It's like
That's right.
incredible. He just incredible. So what are the keys? Well, so your work is a lot about how to develop great managers, how to develop CEOs, and the keys to this whole thing. And now you're not now. I know you had customer focus before, but I mean, you really emphasize it in this book. So what are the keys to gaining and retaining customers?
The first is to understand the promise that you're making. Make clear what the promise you're making to your customers. What's the purpose of your organization? Why does it exist? And what in the end are you promising your customer? And make sure that you live up to that promise. And it's interesting, Dan, that when we have surveyed employees more recently, we found a bit more separation than we've seen in the past between employee employer. And you probably heard this term that started floating around last summer. I suddenly got called about it by a lot of media. It's called quiet quitting.
Yes.
Did you hear that?
Oh, yes.
So it's hard for me to imagine that somebody could have the mentality of quiet. I can see how they could get there if they have poor management, they feel disenfranchised with the company, the organization. They're not there as often, so they start feeling more separation. But it equates very much with a category we've called for the last couple decades not engaged, right? Someone shows up, they do the minimum required, not much else. They don't plan on putting in much discretionary effort. But the quiet quitting employee is basically saying, I'm going to just do the minimum required. I'm not going to go any further than that because I'm either burnout or I just don't feel that sense of commitment. Think about how that in today's workplaces, how you could actually do that when a lot of the work that most of us do requires some level of discretionary effort. You've got a colleague that might need something. You've got a customer that might need something, and you can't predict every time that happens, right? What is the minimum required? It's hard to even define what that is, but it's a mentality that's important to understand. because when that's happening, it's not good for the company. It's not good for the customer. So I guess my point to your question is it starts with the promise you make and what your organization is about, but it's lived through your employees and how they behave every day, and the mentality they bring with them about the customer and how they link their work and the decisions they make. Really in three ways: to their own individual productivity, but also to the collaboration they have with their coworkers, and then the value that they bring to customers. Can they see the link between the work that they're doing and the end result, whether they're direct customer facing or not? And again, I'm using the word customer loosely because it also extends to patients, it extends to members for some nonprofits, and but it's the constituency that we're talking about that you're serving. And if employees can't see how their work connects to that promise that you're making, then there's a big gap, and you're going to have more of that so-called quiet quitting going on in your organization, where people just feel distant. They don't feel it's their responsibility. We saw a drop in people feeling responsible for the quality of service customers receive among young people, whether they're working remote or not. And I want to say young, under 35. But even among the older workers who were exclusively remote, there's a significant drop. So that's the troubling thing to me right now is that we got to get that fixed, but we can. There's no question in my mind that we can fix that problem, and it might just be a natural occurrence from everything we've experienced the last couple of years. And we could have the most highly productive, highly customer-centric organizations in history if we get this right. Mm-hmm. Because we've got autonomy. We figured out autonomy is a good thing, right? That's important. We got to honor that, but we've also got to put some systems in place so that people do feel that they're a part of the organization and feel like they're really making a difference and can see how they're making a difference.
Yes. I'm glad you're talking about this, because the quiet quitting thing deeply concerns me, not just for organizations and customers, but for individuals.
Yeah.
I'm curious about how much of our wellness crisis, and isolation and loneliness really comes from disengagement. That if I am, as a person, am not engaged, it's pretty dang hard to feel fulfilled about life. If I spend, a half or a third of it, somewhere in between there at work, and I'm not engaged with it, it's like, how do I flourish? I don't.
I'm glad you made that point. It's not good for the company, and it's really not good for the individual to spend that much of your time in something that you're bored with, or that you're just not, and some people are loud quitters. They just hate it. Yeah. They can't stand their work. That's a smaller percent, but a big chunk of the workforce are those people showing up and separating themselves from their employer and frustrated with the work, or just plain bored with it. And that's not good for mental health. We just reported increases in diagnosed depression and treatment with depression, which we hadn't seen increases in a long time. It was like 2 out of 10, which is bad enough, but it's gone up to 3 out of 10, and it's grown particularly for young people. But workplaces can play a role. I'm not saying the workplace is the only answer, but workplaces can play a really important role, as you say, Dan, in giving people a sense of meaning and purpose, and having high interest in those moments during the day when you're working, instead of regretting it and resenting it, which can build up over time. And we've seen, when we look at the data longitudinally, engagement at time one is an indicator of new incidents of depression. In other words, active disengagement, feeling negative about your workplace, is a predictor of future incidents of depression and anxiety rates. So it is a factor. It's not the only factor, but it's an important factor, and it's a lot of our time.
Mm-hmm. Well, we need social interaction. I remember back, in high school even, or college, about infants who basically couldn't flourish in orphanages if they didn't have some sort of physical interaction. And that, I mean, that's just a very simple,
Mm-hmm.
we're just made to connect with people. Now, I love my privacy. I love the quiet. You do too.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm not careful, I can go too far in that direction. I have to be very intentional about reaching out to people, and I have clients that I talk to, but just reaching out for conversations. Um, is the Tuesday through Thursday for those who can do hybrid work, is that enough to satisfy, even though we might not like it? Right? Video conferencing is not the same as looking somebody in the face, right? So is that
Trust is
enough?
built. Yeah.
Yeah.
Trust is built differently in person versus. So the people that already knew each other when they went to this forced experiment, um, they did well. They maintained their relationships because they already built trust. They knew what to expect from their colleagues that they'd worked with. But the new people are really at risk because trust is built a lot quicker in person. Those in-person interactions are just different. How we solve problems is different. How we collaborate is different. The random things that happen in a workplace, even the fun things that happen, the physiological cues are very different in person. You can't pick up all of them on video. And so you asked, is the 2 to 3 days enough? In our data, it looks like it at this point in time that, and this goes back to a study we did pre-pandemic on social time, where we found in-person for mood, in-person time mattered more than any other technological way to connect. All of them were important, right? So even the technological ways of connecting are important, and they improve mood. I have a good mood right now just talking to you, Dan. We're on video, but the total amount of time of in-person time mattered the most for good moods, but the total amount of time mattered less than the fact that it happens. So you could relate that to a lot of things, like, should you show up to holidays? Well, of course you need to show up to your holidays, but you don't have to stay too long, but showing up is the key. And our data would suggest that showing up for those 2 to 3 days, and for highly collaborative jobs, it's more like 3 days. That's where we saw the peaks in employee engagement, were those. But something matters even more than that, and that's having at least one meaningful conversation or feedback session or conversation with someone once a week. And we kind of broke down what goes into that, but that matters multiple times more than the number of days. But I would use those 2 to 3 as a guide, because it does force some ritual, and we do have some of those in-person experiences that we wouldn't have thought that we'd have. You get someone like me who does like focus time, and I could easily forget about what happens in person. And then you just kind of start going into a slump over time.
Yes.
I've got an extroverted wife that gets me out with friends, and I end up having a good time. So there's that too.
That helps. That helps. It is interesting, and you brought up, I think, something I want to be sure to include in our conversation. You have, for years, said the manager is central to employee engagement. Is central to customer engagement. How I relate to a manager is how I relate to the CEO. That's in the book. So if I like the CEO, there's a pretty good chance I like my manager. And you're talking about this one, your recommendation is to really thrive as a manager and help your team members thrive. They need to have one meaningful conversation a week with you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it's scaring the daylights out of me. So what are your recommendations about that?
Well, I think a lot of managers on the surface might see that, and it might scare them because they've already got a long list of things that they're working on right there. So if you look at that list of, we tried to list off some of them in the book, just examples of after reviewing managers' job responsibilities, things like clarifying for people what senior management wants to get done, and translating that for their local team. paying attention to pay and benefits and priorities and goals, and thinking about what materials and resources people need. And there's a long list of requirements that managers are already responsible for. If you put that, all of your job responsibilities as a manager on a piece of paper, and you write down underneath that, I've had meaningful feedback in the last week. And you think about how those responsibilities are easier or more efficient if you have that conversation. I think you'll learn that every one of those, or almost all of them, become better or get solved more efficiently if you just have that short conversation once a week and a cadence around it. You're ahead of issues before they escalate again. You can readjust priorities on the fly every week if you need to. You don't have to wait till it's too late. And it doesn't have to be a long conversation if it's regular. 15 to 30 minutes can get it done. Sometimes it might need to be a little bit longer than that. But 15 to 30 minutes, and then what goes into it needs to be pretty inspiring for the individual, and it needs to start with recognition, But to recognize someone effectively, you've got to be in touch with what they're doing. You've got to be in touch with their colleagues too, to know how they're helping out other people, how they're achieving what's on their list, and revisiting how much progress they've made. You also need to know how they like to be recognized. Only 10% of people know that. So, or have someone ask them that. So that's a basic one. When people say what was meaningful feedback, what was extremely meaningful feedback to me, it starts with recognition. It starts with how I collaborate with my team and discussion about that. We know that collaboration now is more important than ever, because for hybrid workers, we're coming and going, and we have to think about what works best there. Goals and priorities, I mentioned that goes into a meaningful conversation according to the respondents or the recipients of it. That I mentioned the amount of time, and then strengths. We talked about strengths a little bit. Do you know my strengths? And are we thinking continuously about how I can use my strengths best and develop them, and partner with other people who might have very different strengths, and to get the work done effectively? It's not that critique isn't a part of it. It can very, very much be a part of it. But when we ask people about weaknesses, that led to less meaningful conversations, probably because in the past, our tendency as humans has been to lead with critique before we build trust. And critique can happen very effectively. Very clear, honest feedback can happen very effectively with people, and corrective feedback can happen very effectively if we've established some trust. If the other person on the other end knows I'm in this for their best interest, and I'm really trying to help them develop, and I'm really trying to help them reach the objectives they have in front of them, then it's it's game on. You share candid information with one another, because it's best for both people in the end. And so that's kind of how a meaningful conversation works. And again, can be short. We found it has to be longer if you don't have that cadence. If it's not once a week. But why not get ahead of all these issues and make the translation of what leadership to the front line more effective? And I think I would challenge managers to take a look at their list of responsibilities and let me know if a meaningful conversation once a week didn't make that better.
Well, my experience with managers, especially those who get promoted up the chain, it becomes a very important thing to learn, that you have to engage, you have to let go of things. You can't do all the stuff yourself. You're going to drive yourself crazy. And that's part of what this is, I think, what this is about. Is building that relationship. And let's face it, a person who is engaged wants to know how to do a better job. It doesn't hurt my feelings if I'm standing on the foul line shooting foul shots and I want to get them in, and somebody says, I don't know if you noticed or not, but you're holding your feet kind of sideways, and you might want to try putting your feet in a different direction. It doesn't hurt my feelings. You know what I mean? Because I want to get the dang ball in the hole.
Right.
So I don't, as long as we have that, like you're saying, ongoing, which I was fascinated by. Basically, if you have a two short conversations is better than one long conversation, is what I wrote in the margin of the book. Just go ahead. And I was curious, it didn't say it in the book, but it felt like maybe they don't have to be in your office, right? I mean,
No.
I feel like sometimes their office is better than your office, or, you know, uh, lunch or on the floor somewhere where you can just take a few minutes. And it feels to me like that's significant here.
That's a great point. It can happen in a variety of places. I've been asked that. Does it have to be in person? I think in the best of all worlds, you would have some of it be in person, because of what we talked about earlier about the value of in person time. That's impossible to replicate with technology right now, anyway. Maybe we'll get there at some point, um, but yeah, it's a great point. You could meet and they're out and changing it up, and to make something meaningful means you're going to kind of do it in a format that works for both of you. And informality is always good. I've seen people go for walking meetings before,
Sure.
and lunch and all that. Going back to that study on social time I was talking about, one of the highest mood periods during the day was when somebody was having lunch or dinner. So dining with a friend, or dining with a colleague in person, of course. And so that maximizes it. So if you're going to really try to maximize mood, you would probably have lunch together or something in person. But you can have it in a lot of different formats and get the same. If you mix it up that way, I think you've already established trust, and it gives you more leeway to have some flexibility in how you do it.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is on this idea of conversations, because let's face it, if you have crappy conversations, it isn't going to help. And one of the tensions that managers feel, I think, is between challenging people and supporting people. Some managers are great at challenging, some managers are great at supporting, and we all need both. Or, we get bored or we get angry, or, it's just negative things. It wasn't necessarily right in the book, but I'm just personally curious about navigating the mix of challenging employees and also supporting employees, so that you get, they get maximum benefit and everybody's flourishing.
I think you do have to have a mix, and I think you can have both at the same time. I think when you're being challenged, you want to know that you're being supported too. So I think the manager needs to be in it with the employee in terms of what they're trying to get done, and be an active part of that. And so the challenge is kind of it's a challenge for both. It's not just the challenge for the individual. It's a challenge for the team. And in some cases, people do need to be challenged to develop a competency, but it's for that individual's best interest. So if the challenge is in the context of being supported, then I think it works. And I think it needs to be in a way that fits with the manager's strengths. So it's authentic.
Yeah.
Right. But there are different ways of challenging people. You might challenge people through achievement. People love, one of the best things we can do as human beings is get something done with other people. It's just it's a very fulfilling thing. But also in some cases it might work to challenge someone through competition, because they happen to be highly competitive. In other cases it might be through development, because that's the way they're wired. So I think we have to start with the individuals. And if we start with authentically who I am as a manager, who you are as an employee, then it will feel authentic. And there's a wide variety of ways that people can challenge one another. But
Well,
when
Jim,
it's authentic, there's trust.
yes. Well, Jim, I've also just wanted to ask, Culture Shock is the book. You've gone to black and white. What's the reasoning between black and white? My wife was down looking at my shelf the other day, and actually, no, I had a person in, and they looked at the shelf and they said, looks like red is the most dominant color. I hadn't paid attention to it, but it made me wonder about this color.
Well, I am not a design expert. We have design expert on our team that does do you like that cover?
Yes, I thought the other
Kind of
color
draws you in.
cover was distinctive as well. I mean, it fits in the sense of it looks like they're all connected. It's connected material. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
I
Yeah,
think there's some intentionality around that. That there's a Gallup look
yeah.
to it, so people know what they're getting. It does say from Gallup on the front of it too, but we have there has been some intentionality around making the look similar across the different books. I know red is a popular color for books. I see a lot of red ones. I probably have, yeah, I've got some on my shelf too. I think it's because it draws attention. The same, maybe the same reason why they tell you not to buy a red car, because the police will spy you.
Good point.
I don't know.
Yes.
I don't know
Yeah.
if there's anything related. I'm not very good with, designing the color schemes. So that's not really my area. I try to focus on the content, but we've got
Yes.
people that do an excellent job at that.
Yes. It's always a pleasure, Jim, to reconnect with you and learn from you. Thank you so much, and thank you for sending the book over. I read the book. I found it to be extremely useful. Wouldn't hesitate to recommend it to anyone who wants to get better at leading and or managing. So thank you for that.
Thanks for your continued interest in our work, Dan. It's always great talking with you.
Yes.